Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice. And welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. And sometimes I talk about more normal things. So today I want to talk about a book that I read, one for the book club that I am a part of, that I've been talking about these past couple months. It's less weird, as my book club friends managed or allowed me to pick the book this month. And since I have a background in accessibility and disability services, I thought I would talk about a book that focused on exactly those things. And so the book that I chose is one that's about discrimination and disability. I am referring to Being Human by Judith Heumann and Kristen Joiner. For those who don't know, Judy Heumann, is a disability civil rights activist primarily, although she does work in other areas of civil rights too, as she did in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, 90s, up until the present moment. She has been in a wheelchair for almost her entire life, as she first had to be in a wheelchair when she was 2, as she suffered from polio when she was younger, and as a result, she lost the ability to walk, and eventually she lost the ability to really use her muscles as they atrophied too, which is unfortunate. But she spent a lot of time doing activist work. She faced a lot of discrimination, and she chose to fight back. And as a result, she became involved with a lot of administrations, including the Clinton administration as well as the Obama administration. And so that's who Judith Heumann is, Judy Heumann. The other person who wrote this book is Kristen Joiner. I don't know a lot about her, but from what I've read, she is also an activist. And she's written this book with Heumann, but also she wrote another book with Heumann, but that's sort of this, but aimed at younger audiences, which I think is great. You know, anything to educate the youngins about disability and the disability civil rights movement. I also think that Kristen Joiner might have been a sort of a ghostwriter or an assistant writer, because Judy Heumann, you know, she had a lot of. She had her muscles atrophy, so writing for prolonged periods of time would probably be difficult for her, and as a result, she would need someone to help her write out her ideas or communicate what she's trying to say, and that's where Kristen comes in. And so, very thrilled to learn about both of these individuals. I might have to do more research on Kristen in the future, but from what I gather, it sounds like she's very much for the cause of fighting not only for civil rights, but for civil rights for individuals with disabilities. And so that's where we are with these authors. Without further ado, let's talk about the book, Being Human. I'll do a summary, a little bit of an analysis, and we will move on from there. So Being Human focuses on Judy Heumann, as I've said before. Judy Heumann was about 2 years old when she was put into a wheelchair after dealing with polio. Her doctor suggested that her parents institutionalize her, which was happening to a lot of children with disabilities around that time. Just put them in an institution, forget about them, don't even check on them, and who knows what's going to happen to them years down the road. That was a pretty big thing that happened. I believe Geraldo did a report on it back when he was still doing actual journalism, and it was a lot. It's very eye-opening, and so that's what was happening to Judy. But her parents, who grew up in Nazi Germany, knew that institutionalization might lead to her death or might put her on the margins of society, which she already was. But they decided against it, and they did their best to make sure she was incorporated in all aspects of society. However, as Judy begins to get older, she begins to notice people staring at her oddly or pitying her, or it becoming more difficult for her to get places because society at that time wasn't very accessible, and so she had to rely on the kindness of others. And so she becomes increasingly aware of how different she is, and as well as the fact that her mom doesn't want to go out of her way, because if her mom goes out of her way to provide for Judy, to get someone in the community to help her, then Judy will be viewed as a burden, and people will less likely want to put her in any events that are coming up. So Judy's going through a lot of that, but very fortunately she's allowed to get into a school and a camp, which makes her feel really great. It's a very inclusive time for her, and as a result, she feels less like a burden. Like, it's still there for her, but these activities being a part of the community make her feel better. She is involved in a school where it's not really expected for her to learn, unfortunately, as was the case prior to the introduction of the IDEA Act in the 70s and 80s. But even still today, people still don't believe that children with disabilities need to actually learn. They're put on, again, the margins of school. She also attended camp where she felt like she belonged. And there was those feelings of being a burden, which continued up until college. She felt a lot of loneliness in college because everyone, she seemed to be the only individual with a disability at the college, at least a visible disability, being in a wheelchair. And on top of that, she realized that a lot of the men at the university didn't see her as a potential source of dating. A guy even approached her and was like, "Oh, do you know anybody who would be willing to go on a date?" And she realized he didn't even see her as a potential date because she was in a wheelchair. But she also notes that her peers at this time are developing a different mindset around disability, whereas her parents subscribed to the medical model, which viewed disability as something that needed to be cured and a flaw that needed to be fixed. Judy and her friends view disability as a social thing. That is a problem with society, how society hasn't been made accessible, and as a result, there's nothing wrong with disability. The problem is on society itself. And so if you fix those flaws inherent in society and make communities more accessible, then disability becomes less of a problem. And she also notes that Judy notes that she takes cues from the civil rights movements that are happening at the time, especially with with Black Americans, as they are dealing with Brown v. Board of Education, as well as fighting the police at the time. So that's what's going on in the background. So something that Judy is learning from at this time. Judy decides that she wants to become a teacher after finishing college, but during her the teacher certification process, she has to go see a doctor to see if everything's okay. And the doctor asks her a lot of invasive questions that they probably wouldn't have asked a person without a disability. And she even goes back later, and there's another two doctors there who are again asking her invasive questions, and they note that she's being combative. Really, she's just asking why they're asking those questions to begin with. And unfortunately, she's rejected from being a teacher. She turns to the ACLU for help, but they know that no discrimination has actually happened. Again, because the Rehabilitation Act and the ADA haven't officially haven't come out yet. There's no discrimination actually taking place here. It's perfectly legal what's happening to her. Judy actually draws attention to this. She gets a lawyer and drums up a lot of media attention, including a New York Times article, and takes us to a court case. And she notes that she manages to successfully sue for money, but also she gets her certification approved, and she begins teaching in addition to doing disability advocacy work, which she greatly loves. And so it's through that court case that she comes to realize that being litigious is important, and also standing up for yourself. And even if you feel scared or whatnot, you should say something. Eventually, Judy Heumann gets a job at Berkeley, and also she starts to work with politicians in Washington, D.C., and she begins lobbying for the rights of people with disabilities. And one of the first things that pops up, one of the pieces of legislation that manages to get passed, is the Rehabilitation Act, which makes it illegal to discriminate based on disability. And what's interesting about this is that the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act was sort of stealthily placed in there. Nobody drew awareness of it. It was just put in there, and it was passed. Unfortunately, Richard Nixon fails to officially enact the Rehabilitation Act and Section 504, and it passes on to Gerald Ford, who also fails to do that. And so during the Carter administration, Judy and her friends are trying to get the Section 504 regulations codified into law with the Health, Education, and Wellness or Welfare Department. And the person in charge of that is actually somewhat in the pocket of businesses and organizations who choose not to provide for individuals with disabilities. And as a result, she has to take the fight to them. Her and her friends across multiple cities end up occupying the health, education, and welfare buildings for 4 weeks. And in the process, they end up going to Washington, D.C., and they force the people in charge to actually sign these. And successfully, she managed to get this passed, which is a major milestone for people with disabilities at the time. Later in the book, Judy also talks about getting her work in getting the ADA passed, the Americans with Disabilities Act law passed, which also helped to further codify the rights of individuals with disabilities. There's a lot of business pushback to this, simply because they say it'd be too costly to enact the laws that the ADA is trying to codify, but again, they managed to draw enough attention to get this piece of legislation passed, which Bush Sr. manages to pass. She then gets a job in the Clinton administration, where she travels around the world and begins advocating for people with disabilities, and she also works with U.S. embassies to make the embassies more accessible, as well as making the cities they're in slightly more accessible. She also gets a job at the World Bank, where she does more of that work, and she also receives a pretty important job in the Obama administration. And as the story ends, she begins to focus on Trump, much like a lot of stories that I've read recently that have reached the current moment. And so with Trump, she begins to worry because a lot of the Republicans want to pass legislation that basically strips some of the regulations and some of the rights away from people with disabilities. And so she notes that there's still a big fight that needs to go on. There's a whole lot of activism that needs to be involved. And she notes it's a lot of work. It's very hard to do all this work, but it's very rewarding, and it's very necessary, because if you let even one marginalized population slip behind, that leaves room to discriminate against so many more. And so it's really something that everyone has to come together and realize that we're all one people and we all deserve equal rights, equitable rights even. And that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, this is an amazing book. I absolutely love it, and I think part of that is because this is the field that I'm in terms of my work, and so it's so fascinating to see where Judy started and where we're at now. One thing that pops up in this book is the idea of disability as a societal burden. It's prevalent throughout Judy's life, and it's prevalent now. Judy notes that from very early on in life, people viewed her disability as a burden, whether it be allowing her into school or even allowing her into college, allowing her to become a teacher. All of these points, people didn't want people with a person with disability in those positions because it was going to be seen as some burden to accommodate that individual. There's an interesting quote that I would like to read to you that comes early on in the story. My mother, however, stopped him. She told him it wasn't necessary, that I'd be okay not being with the other kids in the basement. Now, why would my mother, a woman who spent her half her life working to overcome barriers for me, have declined an offer to have me included in an activity? Because she worried I would be a burden. My mother worried that if having me in the program became too difficult, the pastor might decide the effort wasn't worth it and wouldn't want me back. My mother straddled a fine line between fighting to not have me excluded and worrying that she'd push so hard for inclusion that I'd end up excluded. At Bible school, we were lucky. The pastor was the kind of guy who understood that if all the kids were doing something, it would be weird for me not to do it, too. So he carried me up and down the stairs, despite my mother telling him it wasn't necessary, which I know made my mother happy. So there you get kind of an understanding of the burden feeling. Her mom wants her to be included in this, but even she has these messages that, like, if she pushes too hard, then that's going to poison the well for her daughter to be included in this, but maybe in other things in the community too. People call her a fire hazard when she tries to get into school. They know how costly it is to make certain aspects of the community more accessible. Judy even talks about ugly laws, which state that people with disabilities can't ask for money in communities because nobody should be pressured to see that kind of disability or something, people without limbs or something like that. And so there's a lot of messages out there that people with disabilities are burdens, and that including them in society creates trouble for people without disabilities. They shouldn't have to see that. People with disabilities should remain invisible. And that sends a lot of internalized messages for people with disabilities too. Judy notes for her, but for other people in the story too, who have disabilities, that they've been told all their lives that they aren't good enough, that they aren't normal, that they shouldn't be incorporated into society because it would be costly, because it would produce an undue burden on somebody. And can you imagine how that would feel, being told your entire life that you don't belong in society, that you, because of the disability you were born with or acquired through no decision of your own, most likely, like that means that you're not acceptable. That means that you're a burden upon society and you should leave or be hidden or something like that. And that hasn't gone away. Like it was something that Judy dealt with in the 1950s, 1960s, and even up to the present day. It's still there. You saw that with Donald Trump during his campaign in 2015, 2016. He made fun of the reporter with the disability, which even Judy noted that he made it seem like that reporter was different and therefore not worthy of respect because of their disability. And I don't care if people try to say, oh, he wasn't making fun of their disability. Yes, he was. That's exactly what he was doing. And I don't care to have an argument about whether or not that's true. That's exactly what he was doing. And so there's a need to fight that sign that people with disabilities are a burden upon society. Because if you don't do that, it makes it a whole lot easier to marginalize them and take away their rights and eventually do exactly what the Nazis were doing and exterminating them. You might say, oh, well, that's a big leap between not letting a student with disability go to a certain school and Nazis exterminating them, but that's exactly the path. That's where it leads. And if we don't speak up now, what's going to happen later? Another interesting aspect of this story is how Judy notes that disability is diversity. This is something I myself like to say, that disability isn't bad, disability isn't a flaw. Rather, because I follow the social model of disability, disability is diversity. There are people throughout our society who are different, whether it be the color of their skin, because of their gender, because of their sexual orientation, or because of their disability or their ability. Like a person who is blind is diverse. A person who is in a wheelchair, a person who has Bell's palsy. There are so many different disabilities, and it's a diverse culture out there, and it's really fascinating. That when you view that as something that exists, then providing for individuals with disability becomes a function of life. Oh, this person is blind, and that's okay. They need accommodations. I should provide for that because this person is a part of our society. Judy especially notes this when she occupies the Hugh building later in the story in the 1970s. She notes that everyone in the building kind of realized like we're all one people, and the disability wasn't viewed as different. It was viewed as something beautiful about that person that made them different and unique. And it's something that she believes that needs to be incorporated into our society, especially by people who maybe don't have disabilities. That people with disabilities are normal and diverse and should be seen as beautiful individuals. And I think that's beautiful and wonderful. And I really hope that we can reach that point. But it really seems like with people like Donald Trump out there, it's hard to shift society's views a little bit. Another thing that Judy talks about is the importance of activism and allyship, particularly as it pertains to speaking out when you see something. When you see discrimination taking place. Judy, for her part, when she was being discriminated against, felt very shy and scared, and she didn't want to be viewed as demanding, especially because she was a woman, and if women speak out and try to take charge, they're viewed as wrong or bad. Unfortunately, sexism taking place here too. But Judy notes that it's very important to speak out and do activism, because that is how we let people know that the discrimination they're doing is wrong. And also, there are various types of discrimination that are perfectly legal in one moment, and until someone passes a law, it's going to stay legal. Discrimination against people with disabilities was perfectly legal until suddenly it wasn't. The same applies to black individuals. Preventing a black person from voting was perfectly legal until suddenly it wasn't. And we have to speak out and make sure that those moments get recognized. You see that now too with the trans movement, with transgender individuals. One thing that pops up is the right of a doctor to deny them care based on the status of them being transgender. And the problem there is that given the president, it would be it would be particularly legal for them to do that. Until suddenly when someone passes a law and it isn't. So just because something is legal or not doesn't mean it's good or bad. You have to speak up when you see an injustice happening towards another person. And I think what's interesting here is that much like with hood feminism, Judy is arguing that she doesn't want people without disabilities to come in and be saviors or anything like that. The key here is providing support so that people with disabilities can speak out, and so that we can maybe echo what they're saying and amplify their voices. That's very important, and it's something that I try to do in my work, so that people with disabilities, they have equitable access, especially in higher education. Those are my thoughts on Being Human by Judith Heumann and Kristen Joiner. It's a wonderful, amazing book. It might be on my end of the year list for best books of 2021, even though I think it came out last year. It made me realize a lot about disability and disability advocacy and how I could possibly do better work in that regards. It also made me very aware of the discrimination that Judy experienced, and it was very sad, but also it made me angry, and it made me want to fight it in the future, which I think was a large part of what she was going for with this story. I do think she is a bit too optimistic at times in how we can fight it, because she focuses a lot on shame in the 70s and 80s, how they could shame politicians into listening to them. But in this modern period, a lot of Republicans, especially the people who oppose disability rights and stuff like that, and federal regulations about this sort of thing, like Ted Cruz is incapable of shame, Donald Trump is incapable of shame, so how do you make them listen? And I don't think Judy has a real answer for that. But again, I think speaking out as loud as possible, making sure you can't be ignored in any sort of way, I think that's a powerful thing you can do, and I'm glad that Judy suggested that. Anyways, if you read this story before, or you simply want to comment on what I said here today, feel free to do so below. I would love to hear from you. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that other people can find out about Judith Heumann, an amazing civil rights activist. I feel like a lot of the reason why people don't know about her, even though she's very much on par with people in the Black civil rights movement and also the Latino civil rights movement, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that she was disabled. That she's in a wheelchair, and people tend to ignore those people. But I think this is a name. Judith Heumann is a name that more people should know about. That's my personal preference. Anyway, other than that, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and activisty travels. Farewell.